came in a political week dominated by the asylum seeker debate, with the government refusing to confirm reports a boat carrying Tamil asylum seekers will be handed over to the Sri Lankan Navy. To discuss this, we're joined now by the Director of Legal Advocacy, Daniel Webb, from the Human Rights Law Centre. Welcome to Weekend Breakfast. Now tell me, what is your take on the events of the week involving this asylum seeker boat?
Sure. Well, I mean, as things stand, the best information we have about the fate of these 200 or so people is from the Sri Lankan military. And I think that's really a bit of an indictment on our democracy, that the best information we have about what our government is doing in respect of 200 vulnerable people comes from the military of another country. If reports are true that these 200 people are detained in the middle of the ocean incommunicado and are about to be delivered back into the hands of the very regime they say they need protection from, then Australia will clearly be breaching international law.
Are you involved? How connected are you to the Sri Lankan community here in Australia? Are you able to get, is that another way in which you're getting reports about this boat?
Oh, look, the Sri Lankan community in Australia themselves have very little information about the fate of these people, and understandably they're deeply concerned that that many of these asylum seekers would face harm if they're returned to Sri Lanka. But just like the Australian people, members of the Sri Lankan community here in Australia really don't know where these people are, whether they're okay, whether they're in our government's custody, and if they are, what our government plans to do with them.
We heard this week from the Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who was disputing the notion that Sri Lanka is still an unsafe place to be given that the civil war is over. What's your response to his commentary?
Well, I mean, look, there's widespread reports of ongoing human rights violations in Sri Lanka. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, the US Department of State, all say there are ongoing cases of torture, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, and even wrongful death. But look, don't take their word for it. Our own Department of Immigration assesses a majority of Sri Lankan boat arrivals as genuinely having fled persecution. So when our Prime Minister and our Immigration Minister front the media and say, look, don't worry, Sri Lanka's safe, no one we return there is going to be harmed, they are willfully ignoring their own evidence.
Now, the government, when it introduced this policy, Operation Sovereign Borders, made it very clear that their main aim was to stop people getting on boats in the first place, and that was that was their moral compass, to actually stop that, because of course so many people were dying. Now, would you say that there is some merit to that? Obviously, as it escalates, this policy, obviously people potentially will stop even making the journey in the first place.
I think we do need to strive to prevent the loss of life at sea, but I don't think we need to violate the human rights of survivors in order to do that. I think we need to look at policies that give people who need protection safe pathways through which they can access it. All deterrence policies do is give people who lack options one less. And in terms of the government doing as it said it would, I don't recall them ever saying that in pursuit of their goal of stopping the boats, they would return the persecuted directly back into the hands of their persecutors. And in any event, some sort of undertaking to stop the boats doesn't come with this sort of licence to refuse to tell the Australian people just how you do that.
How much concern do you think there is in the broader population about this specific move of, using means like Skype to assess somebody's asylum claim?
Well, I would hope at least that there's widespread concern, and I think we've seen that this week. The fundamental obligation that Australia has under the Refugee Convention is to not return people to a risk of persecution. That's a life or death decision whether or not someone in fact needs our protection. The only way we can ensure that we don't wrongfully return people to harm is to properly and fairly and thoroughly assess their claims. Now, asking them a couple of questions over Skype from a boat in the middle of the ocean is not a sufficiently sort of fair or rigorous process to make sure that we don't wrongfully return people to harm.
Daniel Webb, just finally, you mentioned before that you believe that this is a breach of international law. What are you going to do about that? Is there a coalition of refugee advocates moving to explore some legal options?
Sure. Well, I mean, whether or not our government is acting lawfully under Australian law is a very relevant question. The answer to it depends on the facts, and our government won't give us any. So a challenge in the Australian courts is very difficult due to the government preventing any legal scrutiny of its actions by keeping their actions a secret. In terms of international law, we've asked the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture to investigate what's happening, to remind Australia of its human rights obligations, to urge Australia to comply with them, and if Australia doesn't, to report those violations to the UN Human Rights Council. So there are those very important accountability mechanisms within the United Nations system, and we're doing what we can to pursue those.
Okay, Daniel Webb from the Human